Thank you so much for joining us today, Brian. I really appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure.
Your paper explores two main schools of thought regarding love as an addiction. The narrow view, which says that only really harmful forms of love are addictive because by definition, an addiction is harmful. And the broader view that all love is potentially or perhaps even mildly addictive, as it's a spectrum or kind of a continuum of an appetite, and that appetite can sometimes become overstimulated. My question is, do you think that there's also a consideration to be made for personal interpretation in terms of when something is addictive or harmful? What one person might call an obsession, another person might call love sickness or puppy love. Who do you think is the ultimate authority on whether a relationship is harmful?
That's a really good question because it plays up the jockeying for power that happens in many discourses where certain people want to claim primacy over the ability to define terms or say how we should refer to certain things. So, the medical, psychiatric, clinical, diagnostic group of people want to be able to say we get to decide what counts as an addiction, whether it's an addiction having to do with romantic, relationships, or whether it's gambling addiction or something else. So even within that field, there's a controversy. Some people think that to speak of love addiction is just inappropriate, that we shouldn't count this as a diagnostic category that would be treated as standard within medicine, for example. They would say, for example, if something is really harmful and obsessive and you are drawn toward certain kinds of relationships despite them being toxic and harmful, we shouldn't refer to that as love. There's also a feminist philosophy argument that goes along these lines. They say love is a positive thing. So if we allow toxic or abusive relationships or something where somebody's welfare is clearly being impaired by the connection, to sort of adorn it with the label love is dangerous and something we shouldn't do. So there's debates within medicine, there's debates within philosophy. And then what I take your point to be is, well, what about the person who's in the relationship? Shouldn't they have some sort of say over how to conceptualize their own experience? And I think that's really important. I think there's a tendency to defer to experts in some sense, sometimes to the exclusion of the person's own interpretation of their life and their relationship. So there can be a sort of paternalism here where somebody will say, I hereby deem your relationship to be one that exhibits, addictive behaviors. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe, sure, I'm obsessed with this person in some sense, but I value that. I enjoy the intensity and the spark of this and so forth. So yeah, there's no universal line that can be drawn in the sand where we're all going to get on board with the analysis. I think for people who are in relationships that many of us deem to be harmful or toxic or bad for them in some way, it certainly makes sense that we would want to try to persuade the person of this perspective and try to bring them information and show them why it is that they might be, tolerating harms more than they should be.
Mhm.
But I do think that there's a risk of sort of overriding someone's own interpretive framework and realizing that there's a lot of complex meanings that we associate with different kinds of interpersonal and romantic experiences. And not all of those can necessarily be captured by these medical diagnostic criteria, even if that was a matter of agreement among experts.
Mm, excellent. Good. Yes. Good point. Thank you. How do you think that this impacts the value judgment based on love when it goes awry or becomes unhealthy? The fact that everyone kind of knows what that initial feeling feels like.
I think maybe in retrospect, I would want to edit my presumption of universality that we included in that paper in a couple of ways. First is that, there's an underlying biological dimension of love that comes from the fact that we evolved as creatures who have to mate with each other in order to reproduce. And certain kinds of bonds, like the parental bond, is important for us to form if we're going to have offspring. And so there's a sort of bioevolutionary story that you can tell about why certain brain level properties exist that support and undergird our experience of love. But then I think it's important to say that the phenomenological experience of love, as inflected through one's cultural context, is not necessarily the same everywhere you go.
Oh, good point.
So, the way that we think about love, for example, the concepts that we use, which types of experiences we even want to label as an instance of love can be subject to cultural and historical contingencies.
Mhm.
So an example that we talk about in the book, which I borrow from Carrie Jenkins, who's a philosopher of love in Canada, I believe. She brings up the example of a lesbian couple in the late 1700s in England. And she says, now, according to the lights of the society at the time, they may be having all the sorts of biological, physiological responses. They find it hard to breathe when they see the other person, and they're excited, and they're hands get clammy when they, hold hands because they're just so in love with each other. They might be having all these kinds of things going on, but the society might not recognize their relationship as it were, a valid instance of love. It might be dismissed as something else. And this can have very real consequences, of course, for their experience, because it means that as they're walking down the street, they might not be able to manifest their feelings for one another. They might not be able to hold hands. They might not be able to, have children together or whatever it might be. And so when you realize that the way that a society gives you a narrative or a set of concepts about love can trickle down and have pretty big implications for your actual experience of relating emotionally and romantically to another person, you start to realize that it isn't the same for everyone, even within a society, as this example shows, much less across societies and so forth. I've just drawn that distinction, that there's individual differences in how love is experienced. Some people report that they don't know if they've experienced love. Some people will say, I read these poems and I watch these films, and I have this evidence that I get that some people seem to be having this ecstatic kind of response to another human being, and they just are beside themselves and so forth. And, to be honest, I've never experienced that, or I'm not sure if I've experienced that. So certainly I think it's the case that it's normalized within society to have an obsessive, all-consuming desire and passion for someone that is dissimilar to how we feel about someone who has an all-consuming desire for alcohol or for drugs or for gambling. The latter sort of thing is more or less universally condemned, whereas the former sort of thing is, at least within contemporary Western society, more or less universally celebrated.
Correct.
But even that wasn't always true. If you think of the story of Romeo and Juliet, obviously, we contemporary readers are very excited about their star-crossed, passionate love, but the families were not at all approving of their connection, because it was seen as a threat to the social order. And so maybe for most of quote unquote Western history, love was seen as a illness, at least the kind of passionate, romantic, early stage love that we're talking about. When you have a crush on someone, that was seen as something that was quite dangerous, because marriages anyway were meant to be based on social and economic factors,
Right.
which families needed to form an alliance, or did you have to have children to run the farm or something like that. But the idea that you would build a lifelong commitment to someone on the back of something so fleeting and unstable as a romantic love as we now conceive of it was seen as an absurdity.
I'm thinking about Fiddler on the Roof right now because of what you just said, in
Oh
terms
yes,
of,
that's fascinating.
you
Yes,
know,
yes,
the way that song "Do You Love Me" and how they were
yes.
arranged marriage, and it just sort of like, is this what, and that
I love
how
that song.
sweet the end of the song is.
Yes, exactly. So I wrote a paper with some colleagues recently on the concept of true love as that
Mhm.
gets invoked in just ordinary discourse. And we tried to figure
Mm,
out, well, what really do people mean when they say that? Or what
mm,
features of a relationship are they trying to pick out, either explicitly or implicitly? And one view is that true love might just be the most highly prototypical love that has all the features of love that we tend to think about, including intimacy, passion, and commitment. And then when we were reflecting on this, we came up with the example of Fiddler on the Roof, where they
oh,
don't have
really?
a passion, they don't have a passionate relationship. It's not that they're, gazing into each other's eyes lovingly, whatever. They basically just have a marriage where they are there for each other, and they, do various tasks around the house and whatever. And they've come to form a sort of intimacy through a shared experience, but
Mhm.
they don't have a prototypical loving relationship if what that requires is, full-fledged passion, full-fledged intimacy, full-fledged commitment. They have a very committed relationship.
Mhm.
They have a certain kind of intimacy, but it's not through direct emotional disclosure or whatever.
Mhm.
But what I take the point of that song to be is that yes, they clearly love each other,
Mhm.
even though they don't fit the kind of passionate love that they are observing in their daughters, let's say.
Right, and the
And so
trajectory
yeah,
was completely different.
exactly,
Yeah. Mhm.
exactly. So I think that's a great point, that love, there are things that are properly so called love, even though they don't necessarily have all the criteria that we tend to think of as being prototypically associated with romantic love.
Mhm. Yeah, and also the chronology of it, in the
Yeah.
sense that, when you say true love, in my head, I'm imagining that electric lightning pow, when
Right.
it has to happen to both people simultaneously, or else it's not true love,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's that, Fiddler and just other relationships where two people can meet, not think much of each other, meet again 10 years later, and then it happens. It's like, I don't know, the value placed on that, like, instantaneous, simultaneous
Yeah.
connection is so much
Yeah.
higher in our society, when it could be 20 years down the road. It just takes some time.
Yeah. And to dwell for a moment on the idea of an arranged marriage, I mean, many people have a view when they think of an arranged marriage as like a forced marriage between, you know, people who, where it's the community requires that they get together. But there's many different ways of doing arranged.
Unwilling. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's many different traditions of arranged marriages, some of which, you know, the partners have a veto at least, and the families are in good faith trying to find people who they think would be compatible for each
Mhm.
other. And so what typically happens, or at least what often happens in those situations, is that the partners are getting together. They're forming a relationship, an ostensibly romantic relationship, not because they fell in love with each other, but because they were set up by their families. And then they have the interesting process of whether they can create a sense of love and
Mhm.
intimacy within the relationship, as it were, from scratch. And in these cases, it might be that it's something that slowly evolves and emerges out of the daily interactions that they have and the kinds of behaviors that they engage in, rather than something that's like being struck by lightning.
Mhm.
And, you know, if you step back and analyze these different ways that a relationship can develop, it's not clear that that's any worse or less worthy of
Exactly.
celebration if
Exactly.
a couple, you know, exercises their agency to try to develop a sense of intimacy, even if they never have that passionate, ecstatic kind of romantic feeling for one
Mhm.
another. The point that comes out of this is uh, we tend to have these social scripts that we inherit from being socialized within a given culture, where we have ideas as to what appropriate relationships should be, and they tend to fall into certain categories. So we think,
Yes.
well, there's the romantic partner relationship, there's the lover relationship, there's the friend relationship, there's the parent-child relationship, and we sort of get handed these by our culture as ways in which we should conceive of our interactions with other people over time. And as a consequence of that, we actually aren't attentive to possibilities that might unfold between us and another person, because we're
Mhm.
trying to measure our interactions against what we think the prescribed relationship norm is. And
Exactly.
so there are some people who say, what if we were to relax our vision a little bit here and blur around the edges and say, why couldn't it be that you could have a friend with whom you also had some intimate experiences without that thereby detracting from or destabilizing the friendship? Or, you know, why couldn't it be the case that you could have what you consider to be a romantic relationship with someone, you live together for many years, but maybe you don't have a sexual interaction with one
Right.
another? Maybe that's okay. Or maybe you have sexual interactions with other people, but you still
Mhm.
consider yourselves to be in a romantic relationship. And it's just, you know, giving us the ability to be a little bit more creative about how we conceive of how we're relating to other people. And then that's going to affect how we do, in fact, relate to other people.
Mhm. Yeah, and agreed. And I read I read something about how, um, particularly with the onset of COVID, how there were people who were, you know, getting divorced, breaking up, but still cohabitating and
Right.
creating this entirely new thing, which is, you know, we're not really roommates, you know, we have a history, we still care deeply about each other. It just the redefining of it, I think is something that I find really fascinating. And like you said at the beginning, just the buckets that we've just been taught to put things in reminds me very much of the gender binary. It's like you're just either one or
Absolutely.
the other.
Yeah.
And all of our language reflects that. There is no
Yeah.
like, you know, you're not my friend, you're not my wife. I don't know
Yeah.
what to call you. There's just the language is tricky because we don't have any word for that in between or something new that you've created yourself. I think there's a lot
It,
of space for
You're
that.
right. And it often constrains our imagination. The
Mhm.
ways that we can even contemplate being with one another are oftentimes shaped and confined by our language. If I don't know how to refer to something, it's a little
Mhm.
hard to explain to others what we're doing. I mean, this is a good example. Suppose you have a relationship that you're developing with someone that isn't clearly, I don't know, a boyfriend girlfriend relationship, or let's say a boyfriend boyfriend relationship or whatever. But it has some of those features. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, so what's your relationship like with so and so? Well, if you don't have a word for what you're doing, you have to sort of, you know, avoid the question or launch into a 12-minute speech about how it's complicated and so forth. But imagine if we had a word for such things and we could
Mhm.
just say, well, we're like this. And then the other person go, oh, okay, I know basically what that is. And so I think it's true that, you know, the conceptual resources that are made available to us through our language can really affect, you know, the social costs of trying to do something new, because it's hard to explain to other people what you're doing
Mhm.
unless they share your presuppositions from the language.
Exactly. And if you can't explain it and you can't point to a, you know, universally understood example. You can't say, you
Right.
know, which maybe then maybe we're getting better there in pop culture. And, you know, I think that perhaps, but there, you know, there are relationships on shows that we can point to that are, you know, a little
Increasingly,
yeah.
fortunately, yeah, that's true. That's true, and that points to an interesting role of TV and film and so forth, and art in general, to help us expand our imaginations as to what's possible, and to create mutually accessible exemplars that we can then point to as a society and say, you know, it's kind of like that relationship from that movie. Yeah.
And yeah, that touchstone is just is so valuable to somebody who doesn't have, you know, doesn't have the words. That's really interesting.